My name is Mario Novelli. I'm the director of the Centre for International Education and the co-PI of the Peer Network. Welcome to everybody to week 2 of the Peer Network lecture series, The Political Economy of Education in Times of Conflict, Crisis and Pandemic. A GCRF AHRC funded network between the Centre for International Education, the University of Sussex, the University of Cape Town, Nazarbayev University, Kazakhstan, and the University of Ulster, Northern Ireland, which aims to promote engagement with the critical political economy, analysis of education in context of conflict and crisis. The lecture is also supported by UCFIET, the UK Forum on International Education and Training. All of these lectures will be live streamed through YouTube and available afterwards, and will become part of a free online open resource for all those interested in learning and sharing knowledge and practice about the political economy of education. Today's session is led by Dr. Prachi Srivastava from Western University, Ontario, Canada, and is focused on the politics of COVID-19 and education. Before I introduce her, I just want to briefly run through a few housekeeping rules and logistics. Firstly, please mute yourself unless you're asking a question in the Q&A. Secondly, please note down in the chat any questions that you want to ask during the talk through the chat function. I will collate them and come back later in the Q&A to request you ask the question. Prachi will talk today for around 35 to 40 minutes. And then we will have a 7-minute Sussex buzz in small breakout rooms so that you can reflect on the content of the lecture. We'll then come back as a group for a plenary Q&A. We'll try to finish promptly around 2:15 UK time. So I'd just like to take a few seconds to introduce Dr. Prachi Srivastava. She's an associate professor at Western University, Ontario, Canada, in the Faculty of Education. She specializes in education and international development. She's a member of the World Bank Expert Advisory Council on Citizen Engagement. Previously, she has served with the United Nations Mission in Kosovo and the International Rescue Committee. She holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Currently, Prachi is working on the global education emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, hence the lecture today. She's leading a high-level policy brief for the T20 task force on COVID-19, which will feed into the G20 summit. And she has also provided recommendations for the Ontario Ministry of Education based on this work, and has been very active across social media, raising a range of issues of the challenges and the relationship between education and the current COVID pandemic. We are very happy to welcome you to this peer lecture, and also to thank you very much for getting up so early in the morning to us. I know that in Ontario, it's 8 a.m. now. So we really appreciate that. And the Zoom is yours. I will just stop my share and pass on to you.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see so many names that I recognize, and a little bit daunting because you'll be listening to what I have to say at this time. I think, I'm not sure if Mario already knew, I'm not a great early bird. So this is really different for me to be up and ready at this time, but I'm so thrilled to be here and lovely to see so many of my colleagues. For those of you who don't know, I used to be a lecturer at the Centre for International Education at Sussex, and it kind of feels a little bit like coming home, even though I'm still far away here. So thank you again, Mario, for inviting me. I am going to start sharing my screen, and then I will get into talking a little bit more. Okay, that's weird. Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit on what we've discussed in terms of the COVID-19 scenario. Can you tell me, can you actually see my screen? Is that all right? It's minimized though, I know. And if I do this, can you see my talk? No. Okay. That's good. So I'm doing something a little bit different today, which is I have a bit of a prepared talk because a lot of the issues that I'll be discussing in my mind are conceptual. And what I want to do is actually bring our attention a little bit to some of the underlying assumptions that are framing the discourse around COVID-19 and education globally. And for that, I just find it easier to actually have a prepared talk rather than kind of and ah through it. So those are a little bit of the presentation, kind of the way that the presentation will go today. And I apologize if you prefer slides. There's kind of another issue around that as well, which is for me, this is a bit of a private lecture in a very public space, and it will be able to be accessed across time and space. And so extracting snippets out of, for all of us who are, context right now, it's really a complete that we are working in right now. If there are questions at any point, please do raise them in the chat box and I'll be very happy to answer them. I'm also happy to receive emails, and I'm active on Twitter. So if you have questions, feel free to speak with me on social media as well. So as Mario has explained and introduced, since March, I've been working on the global education emergency caused by COVID-19, globally and domestically in Canada. Globally, I've really have been focusing a lot on the G20 response and leading that brief for a special task force on COVID-19. Domestically, I've been focusing on Ontario, which has the second highest cases in Canada and which is the most populous province. It's one of our richest provinces as well. And so what I have been doing on that is kind of trying to mobilize some policy action. And I've also created a school dashboard that will link the COVID school related cases to school level socioeconomic data to give a better understanding of the potential equity effects in terms of which schools are being affected. It's going to be released in the next week. And right now it's like the biggest happiness thrill of my life in terms of working on this, because it feels like something real and concrete that we can contribute. But all these activities have brought to the foreground the inextricable role of politics, big P and small p, in steering the pandemic and the global education emergency. Big P politics, or simply the macro systems and activities of decision-making and governance, the formal institutions or rules, and the multitude of actors involved in mitigating and mediating those activities and systems. So that's what I'm talking about when we're talking big P politics. And of course, small p politics, the codified unstructured norms and micronorms that structure and guide those decisions or facilitate inaction and their interplay with the big P systems, institutions, and actors. The way the big P and small p are playing out in the education pandemic response remind us that no matter how much reductive, technicist, or quote unquote objective discourse has been used to characterize education and the processes of education governance, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, and using discourse of evidence and expertise, and of course the increased intermingling of state and non-state interests, fundamentally, education is and will remain a deeply political sphere. It defines us. It defines us as individuals and as a collective. It is, in essence, reflective of our values, our ambitions. It is a systemized collection of what our societies privilege, who they privilege, how, and on what terms. On a very relatable level, we know this. As a concerned citizen, a student, or a researcher, we, over the last many months, experienced that the responses to the pandemic and the global education emergency are far from apolitical. They are imbued with a certain action or inaction, a legitimization or delegitimization of evidence and science and knowledge. The responses speak volumes about whose futures and lives and opportunities we value and whose we do not. I will first start off by characterizing the context of the emergency and then delve into more of a conceptual expose, highlighting mainly the role of the underlying assumptions in framing the current context for education and the pandemic. So many of you must have been monitoring, or some of you must have been monitoring the school closures as they occurred. And this, this slide really just takes some of the work that had been, monitoring work that had been done by UNESCO and in terms of monitoring the school closures. And I found it to be very useful and also very telling. For those of us who are following the pandemic and education, it is no exaggeration to say that we are witnessing the most severe crisis in education we have experienced in modern history, the impact of which will affect an entire generation, the full consequences of which we will not know for at least one full education cycle, or more simply, a generation. The first phase of the pandemic was characterized by near universal policy response in the form of countrywide school closures. And you can see that on this map. More than 190 countries instituted countrywide closures, and there were localized school closures in 6 countries. This affected roughly 1.6 or 1.7 billion learners. That number represents roughly 97% of the total population of children and youth, if you use the world population data, and 90% of learners, according to UIS data. This is roughly a fifth of humanity on our planet. That number, I think, is, for all of us working in this, is just completely staggering. Now, of course, we know that with school closures, there are severe effects. This slide outlines some of them: learning loss and dropout, physical and sexual abuse, increased underage pregnancies, mental health and psychosocial impacts, reduced emotional support, loss of essential services. Of course, schools are not just a place for education and learning, formal education and learning, they also provide a hub of services. And a lot of these services are accessed by our most vulnerable communities. There are compounded effects on the vulnerable and marginalized groups, of those from lower income backgrounds, children with special needs, excluded communities, of course, girls in low income and low middle income countries, and those affected by vulnerable circumstances and by crisis and conflict that already were affecting about 260 million children before we started the pandemic. So the pandemic essentially has laid bare the extent to which most education systems were unprepared for crisis and crisis-sensitive planning. Earlier in my career, as Mario mentioned, I actually started working in education in conflict-affected contexts, and I saw the dissonance in many of our systems with the inability to deal with what we had been thrust into. In many contexts, particularly in high-income countries of the quote-unquote West or North, education systems have been operating in silos for many years. This leads to a disconnect from knowledge, resources, and expertise. It provides a buffer for ministries and departments to act in isolation or not to act with relative ease. I'll come back to this inaction, and I'll come back to how it is facilitated by one of the underlying assumptions of the discourse. So regardless of the closures and regardless of the fact that the pandemic has interrupted regular formal provision of education, the unalienable right to education remains. And for many of us here, we've been working on the right to education for years. We buy into or take very strongly the assumption that states are the principal duty bearers under international human rights law to respect, fulfill, protect the right to education. And the crisis actually highlights the centrality of these obligations. The crisis should actually compel us to demand that our states act in those ways. You can see on this slide that in terms of the obligations concerning the right to education, education in all its forms and all its levels should be available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable. These obligations do not change when we enter crisis or emergency, and in fact, they are heightened. Oops. But the ability of countries to enact their obligations will be affected by capacity issues. And they will also be affected by their situations when they entered the pandemic. And this is very strongly related to capacity, supply, and financing issues that characterized education systems when we entered the pandemic, new pandemic-related compulsions, and the level of crisis preparedness that systems had in place. Pre-existing institutional education systems and institutional education systems inequities are crucial in this regard. These include inadequate and inequitable domestic and international education financing, under or presumed lower quality supply, and capacity issues inhibiting the implementation of necessary measures. This, I would argue, really depends on the context, but in every system, there are issues which we were dealing with pre-existing to the pandemic, which will be heightened, and new issues that will appear. We are at this point beginning to see education policy sway. In many countries, we just entered a new academic year. What does that mean? So while the first responses were nearly universal, policy sway is contextual and will be contextual. It will, however, be fragmented. It will be volatile. Some systems will continue to institute blunt, open-close strategies of their systems. Others will be more nuanced and localized. Now, this is where we get into some of the more conceptual questions. And this is where I kind of stopped with the slides. So you're gonna have to just look at my animated face, if that's okay. And I'm gonna stop screen share. Mario, is that all right with you? Okay. So.
Yes, perfect.
Great. If you don't hear me at any point, Mario, just jump in because I'm not really watching the screen anymore. Okay, thank you. So what are some of the concerns that are driving this policy sway? I argue that short-term economic incentives and crude efficiencies are driving education policy sway. We are relying on a severe and uncritical, we are on a severe and uncritical over-reliance on what I referred to in an earlier paper as the mobilizing frame of scarce resources. And we are seeing globally an unwillingness to invest in the areas that we need to. These are particularly difficult to justify in some contexts. And in some contexts, they might be more legitimate. But in contexts like Canada, where I currently sit, it is really hard to justify. So there are also very severe and real insecurities which pose greater risk to life and well-being in certain countries, and especially in countries with larger informal economies, more restricted social safety nets. Some of the other illnesses may be much more compelling. The collapse of the economies and how this is going to affect 1 or 2 generations may be much more compelling. But I argue that we cannot assess education policy sway in the time of the pandemic without first considering the underlying assumptions framing the education emergency caused by COVID. And why? Why do I say that? Because our guiding assumptions are critical in framing knowledge, in framing systems and their governance, in framing systems of knowledge. That is our education systems. These assumptions frame what we think is worthy. They frame who is worthy to be fully inserted in those systems and on what terms, what the purpose of those systems are, who will shape them and who will not, for what purposes, for whom, and how. At every point, assumptions guide our decisions. They shape our systems. They structure complex social phenomena which characterize and make understandable our daily lived experiences. When woven together, these assumptions form the meta-narrative characterizing the form and function of our education systems. In this case, the context of the pandemic and towards recovery. Assumptions can be dangerous because they may be incomplete, uncritical, or colonial. They can mute certain voices. But if inclusive and consciously critical, think here of Paulo Freire's conscientization, they can provide a reorienting framework, the capacity to reimagine education and its role in society and recovery. And that part is really exciting. So here I turn to a little bit of postmodern theory, just a little bit, just bear with me. Meta-narratives, a concept that was derived by the postmodern perspective of Lyotard, are the totalizing explanations, the grand theories used to explain complex social phenomena. Their utility is attractive because they reduce the complexity of otherwise disparate, fractious, and intricate ideas, events, and phenomena into seemingly comprehensive explanations that signal universal truths or values. Meta-narratives render complexities comprehensible. They are, in the truest sense of the term, discursive. They rely on discourse. Their legitimacy is accepted by propagating dominant discourse, and that discourse rests on seemingly neutral assumptions. When critically analyzed, the assumptions favor the interests of maintaining established power structures. There is, of course, room for agency. There's room for agency in rejecting dominant or crafting new assumptions. However, this route is highly contested and is subject to broad-based delegitimization. So if you find yourself banging your head against a wall, you're probably trying to fight the dominant discourse. Now, what are some of the assumptions framing our starting points for COVID-19 and education? I outlined three. And this is towards, now we're getting to the meaty part, or towards almost the last third of the talk. First, the dangerous discourse that we simply do not know, that this pandemic has thrust the world into uncharted territory, which requires entirely new knowledge, new data, new evidence. Let's unpack that. Yes, the pandemic has brought on mass closures of systems globally in a way that no other modern event has. However, it is rather simplistic to say that we have no discourse of inaction, literature of an entire discipline of study. And we are here, we are part of that tradition. We have 50 or 60 years of modern literature and inequities, social cohesion. We have a range of global institutions that have produced, commissioned, and been at the forefront of knowledge, evidence, and data production to address education inequities and education in emergencies. We have an international global system on architecture. We have the SDGs. Previously, we had the EFA goals and the MDGs. We have global task forces on teaching and learning, on metrics, on data. This assumption that we just do not know, and so we flounder, ignores the rich history of educational research and the discipline that can actually be reappropriated, be made more inclusive, and applied to understand some aspects of the effects on education. But by buying into those assumptions, we delay action or we justify inaction. What's the second assumption? The second is that the pandemic is a great equalizer, that we're all in this together. This was one of the first slogans of the pandemic in the earlier days, and it was a slogan that I heard repeated in many contexts. It was the idea that the pandemic doesn't discriminate, that it can affect everybody, young and old, rich and poor. But actually, we know that it does discriminate. There are data coming out, and actually from the UK produced one of the earlier reports, the Bain report, in terms of the effects of the pandemic, which was highly contested and was almost suppressed. We know that the pandemic does discriminate. It will have more severe effects on certain populations, groups, and countries than it does on others. Certain inequities will harden, new ones will appear. Roughly, as we speak, it's estimated that 900 million children still have not returned to school due to pandemic closures or have returned in precarious circumstances. Some might never return. We need to make sure that they are not silenced, that we understand that we are in a vastly different world now when it comes to education than we were in February. And that education research and efforts must begin with those at the center, with them in the center. Third, what's the third assumption? The third is that simply having evidence will inform policy action. And those of us who are involved in trying to mobilize policy action know that this is manifestly not the case. All of us as citizens can see that the way that the macro responses to the pandemic have been enacted by certain governments has been highly political. The uptake of evidence is political. It can be couched in resource constraints, which may be more valid in some contexts than others, but it can also be ignored. It can be delegitimized in favor of other interests, and we need to be mindful of that. So finally, and I end with just 3 points, what do we do to move forward? I have 3 interrelated considerations. The first is that we began on a concerted effort to mobilize existing data, evidence, and knowledge. But that effort must be conscious and critical. It must re-examine and that we already have in a more concerted, cohesive way. Now, secondly, and interrelated, having said that there is existing knowledge, of course there are limits. The precisions on the direct impact of the pandemic need to be investigated, centering on the already marginalized and vulnerable. Some effects will be much longer term, the magnitude of learning loss, for example, or the nature of foregone life opportunities, the consequences on social mobility. Some will be more immediate. How are services being delivered and provided right now? What are the experiences of learners of the most vulnerable and marginalized and families right now? What are the immediate policy responses? And finally, third, we must re-examine which knowledge and evidence have been historically included into that cadre and which have been excluded. Where are the centers of knowledge production? Are these framed in a colonized understanding of knowledge and knowledge systems? We need a rapprochement of academic and grassroots and policy-oriented researchers, particularly from the quote-unquote global South and from colonized communities. And we need a true opening of knowledge production. So I'm going to end there in terms of my formal presentation. I hope that there is some food for thought. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to give me the opportunity to actually think about my own perceptions and my assumptions. And I'll hand the mic over back to Mario. Thank you.